George Bernard Shaw said that progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. But how do we change our minds? One may argue that the entire process of growth hinges on discovery, encountering new information in the world with curiosity, openness, and without being fused to all of our preconceived notions about things. It seems that this may begin with asking good questions. Theorists and researchers alike note the importance of asking good questions. But where do we learn how to? Welcome to the Behaviorist Podcast with Work Wisdom, where we help you adopt high-performance mindsets, behaviors, communication, and culture. I'm your host, Carmela Tress. Our intention for the Behaviorist Podcast is to share accessible, concrete practices that you can weave into your whole life to begin a shift toward joy and meaningful achievement. Today, we're turning our focus on the art of asking good questions. We're grateful to have Scott Walt joining me. Scott Waltman is a clinician, international trainer, and practice-based researcher. His interests include evidence-based psychotherapy practice, training, and implementation in systems that provide care to underserved populations. He is president-elect of both the Academy of Cognitive and Behavioral Therapies and the International Association of Cognitive Behavioral Therapies. He is board certified in behavioral and cognitive psychology from the American Board of Professional Psychology. Dr. Waltman worked as a CBT trainer for one of Dr. Aaron Beck's CBT implementation teams in the Philadelphia Public Mental Health System. He is the first author of the Stoicism Workbook, How the Wisdom of Socrates Can Help You Build Resilience and Overcome Anything Life Throws at You. On a personal note, Scott is one of my dearest friends and one of the funniest and smartest humans you will ever meet. So we are excited to take some time today to explore the art of asking good questions. So hi, Scott.
Hi.
How you doing?
I am good. I'm so excited to be here.
Awesome. So let's just dive into our conversation. So what's the deal with Stoicism and Socrates? Like, what's that all about? Why should we be channeling them?
Am I right? That always reminds me of like a Seinfeld bit. Like, what's the deal with Socrates? Am I right? I don't know. It feels to me like when Kramer is like house sitting for Jerry and he's like pretending to be Jerry. He's just walking around doing bits. I don't know. I love that. That's funny. What is the deal with Socrates and Stoicism? That's a fantastic question. I'm obviously obsessed with both of these things. And how did I get here? Why does it matter? I think that's a good thing to think about. So, as a CBT trainer, we're constantly trying to teach people, how do you teach other people how to use these skills that are useful? Because CBT is a way of thinking, and so you're trying to teach somebody else how to teach somebody else how to think through these things, which is challenging. A lot of times, people fall into the pitfall of trying to just tell people, here's what you should do, but the goal is to think with people instead of think for them, to help people engage like experientially in a process-based way, which is harder. I mean, it's more meaningful, it's deeper, but it's harder to do. And so if this was like a therapy-based podcast, I might spend more time getting into like how did we get through this process. But essentially, through some quantitative and qualitative research, we found that the way we were teaching Socratic questioning wasn't ideal, and it wasn't being as effective as we wanted it to be. And so we retooled it and came up with a new framework. And we made a therapist manual, which has been very successful, which is exciting. And then in marketing that therapist manual, I ended up reaching more like regular people who were super interested in this topic. And so then there was a need to create a resource or a product for folks who are just regular people who don't want to read therapy manuals, which I understand. And so in order to do that, I had to essentially like get back into the original text and read like, well, how does Socrates come to be Socrates, and what happened after Socrates, and like how can we approach this in a more like philosophy-based approach, which was so much fun. My sense is you might let me nerd out for just a little bit. I promise I'm not going to nerd out too much, but let me nerd out for just a moment.
I love when you nerd out.
So the story of Socrates, right? How does Socrates become Socrates? So as the story goes, initially Socrates was kind of a more of a regular guy, right? His father was a stonemason. His mother was a midwife. He himself had been a soldier. That wasn't unique at the time. Pretty much everyone would have been a soldier. And then one of his friends went to go see the oracle at Delphi, who was supposed to be the all-knowing voice of the gods, and asked the oracle, who's the wisest? And then the oracle answered back, well, none is wiser than Socrates. And if somebody said this about me, I might be like, oh, awesome, I'm going to put this on my CV. Like, oracle said I'm the wisest. But Socrates was much, much more humble and wise because of his humility. And it got back to him, and he was perplexed because on one hand, he was like a deeply spiritual man who believed that the gods were real, and he believed that like the oracle like spoke for them. And so he's like, I'm getting information that says I'm the wisest, but he also knows himself very well and says, but I'm not that wise. Like, there's a lot I don't know. This can't be right. So he lands on this conclusion that, well, surely they must just be misinformed. If I can go find somebody who knows more than me, then I can be free from this burden, and I can go about living my life the way I want to live it. So he went out to try and find somebody who was like really wise to like free himself. And so he would approach somebody and be like, okay, what do you know a lot about? Well, let's have a conversation. Let me test you to prove that you really know what you're talking about. And he found in this process that a lot of us are just walking through life based on a lot of assumptions that we've never really looked at, and there's a lot of ignorances that we have. And the thing that he really settled on was this idea of like being ignorant of our own ignorance, where there's things that we don't know, and then we don't even know that we don't know them, and that's really dangerous, right? If you say we don't even know what we don't know. And so he developed a method to try and help people uncover what he would call their conceit of knowledge, which is just a fantastic language, to try and help people overcome their blind spots, which is really important no matter what kind of setting you're in, like in a leadership position, in a therapy position, in a relationship position, trying to figure out, well, what kind of assumptions do you have? Like, do you really know that? And then after the death of Socrates, there were a number of schools of philosophy that emerged from that. Stoicism was one of the more robust ones, which went on to be influential with Rome. The famous Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic philosopher, and then Stoic philosophy influenced a lot of things throughout the ages, including like around the American Revolution, when out of Valley Forge, which isn't far from you, right? So out of Valley Forge, during the winter, George Washington had a playhouse built, and they put on a performance of Cato, a Tragedy, which was this really famous Stoic play at the time, which was all about like overcoming and fighting against tyranny, which was really popular around that age, that part of the British Empire. But then like about a decade or two ago, a few really famous books came out, and Stoicism really exploded in popularity. So it's out, it's exciting, it's popular, and I love it a lot.
Well, and I think you're already pointing to some of the things that become really critical. Starting to reflect on and even having the mindset that it's important for us to question our assumptions and get a sense that there are things that we don't know, that we don't know, that we don't know. Like, those become really fundamental, and it makes me think, contextually, why is it important for us to be able to ask good questions of ourselves, or as leaders, or when we are trying to run a team or our staff? And, that's, I guess my next question is, why do you think, given all of this that you're synthesizing, why do you think it's so important for us to be able to ask good questions?
Yeah, I love that. Well, and I think if Socrates was here, a classic Socrates move would be to first say, well, let's operationalize this. Like, what are we calling a good question? Because sometimes people might think a good question is one that, like a devil's advocate kind of thing. Well, let's kind of test this out. Is this really going to work? Some people might say a good question is really trying to understand like the context of something and how it makes sense. So I think, first you might think about what are good questions. And usually when I'm teaching somebody who's new to therapy or even philosophy, they want to learn good questions so they can be impressive in like conversations. And then I usually say that's like, and they want like a list. Like, give me a list of questions and I'll ask these and I'll be really smart. And it's the dumbest way to approach these kinds of things. Because can you imagine, like, if you knew somebody and they had like 7 questions and they were just constantly asking you those same 7 questions, you wouldn't talk to them anymore. You'd be like, this man's a worksheet. I'm not going to have a conversation with them anymore. This is crazy.
Yeah.
But I think good questions are derived from having a good intention. And pulling back to Socrates, right? Socrates says philosophy begins in wonder or curiosity. So really having like a true curiosity to try and understand what's going on is going to make us have good questions. And then having good questions is going to then cultivate our curiosity. So I think what we need to be able to do is be able to see the forest and the trees, right? Because sometimes we get so hampered and so stuck in the path that we're on and the goals that we have, the objective that we have. There's this vision that we had 2 years ago that we thought was the perfect vision. And then it's kind of like that moment in Jurassic Park where Jeff Goldblum's like, okay, like you were so focused on whether you could do it, you didn't ask if you should do it. And sometimes I find myself completing a task and I'm like, I did it, awesome. And then I'll say, but why did I do that? Like, what was the point of this? Was this really, like, I was just proving my own narcissism. This doesn't make any sense.
Oof. Oh, that's so good. So just to highlight a couple of things that you're saying, you're talking about good questions being defined by, in part, their function, their purpose. What are we tapping into? What are we cultivating? Are we taking different perspectives so that we can see something bigger picture or get into more nuances, see something more clearly? Are we challenging assumptions? Are we testing hypotheses to see if this grand idea we had really panned out, or if there was something that didn't quite go the way we may have anticipated or expected it would go? That curiosity allows us to look at context and how context can shift how something plays out, that something may operate one way in one context and then operate a totally different way in another context.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. So good question.
Can I add one more thought to that? Is that okay?
Yes.
So a big part of the framework we came up with was highlighting this pitfall that a lot of therapists get focused on trying to help the client see it from their point of view, which it's a good intention. But the challenge is as humans, we have this thing called the righting reflex, where if I try to convince you of something, the more I try to convince you of it, the more likely you are to kind of lean against me into your own views. And so the framework is more about trying to help the therapist see it from the client's point of view first, and then try and expand that point of view together. But if you think about this like in a different kind of setting, this might involve good questions or not first focus on trying to make the person you're talking to come to your side, but first trying to say, well, help me understand where you're coming from. Help me understand the context. Help me understand how this makes sense. And then as you're seeing where they're at, then you're able to see, well, what do they not see and what do they not know? And you can try and expand that point of view together for like a synthesis.
That is so critical for leaders because when we are trying to collaborate or facilitate collaboration or get a product or a mission accomplished, sometimes we can be so focused on an end goal and how we believe people should or could be contributing to that end goal that we don't necessarily cultivate that curiosity of what's going on for them. How are they thinking about this? Why does their way make sense? And so one of the things it sounds like you're recommending from this Socratic dialogue perspective is, why don't we adopt our staff person, our team member, our even someone we're in relationship with, why don't we try to understand it from their point of view first, and then collaboratively get curious together to see maybe how their perspective butts up against our perspective, things that both of us may be missing. So really expanding through this curious observation together. Am I getting that?
Yeah, totally, totally. Well, and I think it's multi-benefited, right? In that, one, like if you're being really curious, you're going to learn something you didn't know. But two, it's good for the relationship, right? If you're the famous saying is people don't care how much they know until they know how much you care, and you can't fake that, right? Like we've all been in meetings with leadership where leadership is saying like we want to hear your concerns, and they're not listening, and they're just like checking a box, and then they're going to come back and do whatever they're going to do, and we tend to have less skin in the game. We tend to care less in those kind of jobs. But if you're talking to somebody from leadership and they sincerely care, they're sincerely trying to understand, you can tell that you matter, you're seen. That does a lot.
Yeah, so you're bringing up really two constructs here that I just want to hearken to really briefly. One is psychological safety, this idea that when someone brings different perspectives, when they bring vulnerability, when they notice or make mistakes, when they catch things, that their voice, their perspective will be held with honor, valued, and, not just kind of acknowledged, but, taken seriously. And that can foster an environment where people want to speak up. They feel encouraged to speak up, like they're not going to be punished, or even that they will be appreciated because they're speaking up. And I think you're kind of speaking to that element, that when we believe there isn't going to be follow through, or when leadership is having a hard time, we've all, when we've been in leadership roles, felt conflicting demands. And when we're navigating those conflicting demands plus time pressure, it can be easy to shortcut and to, skip the question, skip the perspective taking, and just try to get stuff done. And what you're pointing out here is that there may be downsides to that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, I was curious to ask you what you have noticed have been some barriers. What makes it so hard to ask these curious questions? And I think we're already speaking to one of those, all of the conflicting pressures. But what are some other ones you've experienced that can make it so difficult?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the problems that we have is that sometimes people aren't really listening to what people are saying. They're thinking about how they're going to respond while the other person's talking. And that really undercuts like the power of yourself in the conversation. My experience is that the session, if I'm in a conversation and I ask a really, really beautiful question, but if I'm not really in it, like in like the soft skills kind of way, if I'm not really listening, if it's as much about the interaction of the process as it is about the product of a good question. Where really having a good question is more about trying to set the stage for it. Like it's almost like the interpersonal interaction, the listening, the caring, the empathy, the tone, the process, the flow is like, it's like a foreplay in a sense, where you can't skip it or it's not going to be good.
Love that metaphor. And I think that's really critical because this is contextual stuff, right? If we're asking curious questions, making observations together in the context of connection, then learning can happen. There's this space. But if it's lip service, if it isn't genuine, if it isn't present, then that is felt. And how are we supposed to feign curiosity with someone and have them buy it when those other features aren't in place? So even this very conversation, we don't want the takeaway to be, I've gotten 3 ideas of new ways to ask questions, and, that just get kind of checklisted into somebody's meetings, or, the next time they're trying to talk to their staff. When instead, perhaps a takeaway could be that when we're stepping outside of our own perspective, getting curious as a part of connecting with the people that we're trying to do important life things with that matter, that those things coming together, like you said, empathy, compassion, curiosity, interest, that those things together are what allow us to learn with and from each other.
Oh, totally. I think that it comes back to that psychological safety, right? If I feel safe, I'm less defensive. If I'm less defensive, you don't need to be as incredibly precise in your language with me because I know that you care, right? I think it's important to technically be proficient, but it's useless without the relationship.
Yeah. I'm finding myself thinking about how a part of what is difficult is holding space for that vulnerability. When we ask questions, we're revealing things we don't know. And I think that defensiveness, like you were speaking to a moment ago, can in part be related to almost like shielding our vulnerability. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think a lot of times people in authority feel this like power to be like omniscient, all powerful, this like sage who knows everything. Which I mean, there is like maybe a kernel of truth to that, right? And you can't, just like as a parent, right? It's important that you're modeling humanity, but you're also not like sitting with your kid at nighttime being like, I don't know what happens when we die. I don't know if anything is real. I don't know what's going on. Like you need to have like some piece of like confidence, so people can at least borrow your confidence. I think there's two strategies that I like. I don't know what you think about these, but there's 2 strategies that I like. So I think one is just trying to hold gently this idea that like I don't need to know everything, right? I mean, the smartest person in the room isn't actually the smartest person in the room. The smartest person in the room is the person who can see who the smartest person in the room is and can listen and synthesize the information together. So in leadership, you don't actually need to be the wisest. You just need to have the wisest there with you, and you need to have the wisdom to recognize wisdom. But I think also this idea of perspective taking is really valuable. Like if you're asking questions, you don't need to be saying like, I don't understand any of this. You can say, well, like from your perspective, what does this look like? Walk me through your experience with this. Help me understand like from where you're at, the way you interact with this variable. And then it's not like, you're not saying I don't know anything about it. You're saying like, I want to get your take.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Sorry, I wanted to make sure I wasn't interrupting you.
Oh, you're fine.
I love that because I do think that sometimes there's this maybe all or nothing thinking where somebody feels like admitting, or a pressure that admitting that they don't know something is almost like conceding that they know nothing about anything and they should not be in the room at all. And so, that can maintain this hiding or defending against their vulnerabilities of what they don't know. But if we can hold, like you were saying, that I don't have to know everything, I can encounter new information, gain flexibility through it, synthesize new material, and ever be growing. Then we can absorb so much that wasn't possible. Am I getting that?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So it sounds like part of this is like intrapersonal, and part of this is intrapersonal. Part of this is your ability, your ego strength to be able to sit and say like, it's okay. I don't need to be perfect. That's fine. I don't need to know everything. That's fine. I just need to be curious. I need to have an idea of what the objective is. I need to listen with compassion. I need to try and find the kernel of truth in what I'm hearing. I can point out, well, here's how I'm seeing it. We can pull it together. And then I can compare this new summary with the initial statement. How do these fit together? And what are we going to do about it?
Yeah. Oh, I love that. We're such behaviorists here. What are we going to do about it? So this isn't just navel gazing. This isn't just thinking for thinking's sake. This is so that we can put into action living in meaningful ways. allow ourselves to be changed and transformed to live a life that's really meaningful to us. That's really,
totally.
That's awesome. So I'm curious, what is something that you've learned or a piece of wisdom you've gained as you've gone about writing these two incredible books, by the way? I'm still writing
Thank you.
my review of your second, but every clinician and psychologist I meet, I tell them about how your first book, along with Trent Codd and Lynn McFarr and Brett Moore, is such a game changer. I mean, it is just such an incredible book. But in this process, what are some things that you've learned along the way?
Oh, okay. I gotta keep this short. I'm just constantly learning. But I think the main thing I've learned is that I want to be constantly learning. I want to be constantly improving and gaining and sharpening and nourishing myself in a sense. Right? I try to approach every day, every interaction, even every session, trying to learn something to better understand the idea, to better understand the disorder, to better understand the human that I'm sitting with. And I find that true spark of curiosity and passion that I have, I think that makes it all very easy to do, because I'm not coming into the session saying all right, well, you're wrong, I'm right, you've been doing this wrong, let me show you how to do this. But I'm saying okay, I know shit and you know shit, and let's put it together, let's figure it out. So I think being just trying to be truly curious makes my day interesting, makes it wonderful, and I love it. From a cognitive perspective, I think a lot of it comes back to are we on the same page about what we're even talking about here? For example, if I'm working with somebody and they have this belief that they're a failure, and I'm probably seeing them at a hard time in their life, the strategy we might have used 20 or 30 years ago might have been to quickly say, well, let's look at the evidence that you're a failure, let's look at the evidence you're not a failure, and then let's compare the evidence and make a decision. But I think first, we would contextually try and say, well, what do you mean when you say failure? What's this concept, this idea, the goal that you're trying to live up to? Where is this a good goal? Where does this come from? I might then start playing around with that definition, right? So if you've had some failures and some successes, does that mean you're a failure? If you're a failure now and you have a success later, does that negate the failing? Were you born a failure? Is it possible for a baby to be a failure? If we went to a maternity ward and looked at all the babies, could you tell me which ones are losers? Because probably not, right? But from this conversation, we can have a discussion about well, what does it really mean to be a loser? And we might shift it instead of the experience of failing, which you can't go through life without failing. And the only way to go through life without failing is never try. And if you never try, that's what failing is. And so it's impossible to never fail. But coming back to that definition level is usually pretty helpful for me. I enjoy that a lot. I was doing a training, I think the first training I did oddly the book is really popular in Brazil. And one of the first training I was doing in Brazil, somebody made a meme of me that said distorted thoughts are based on distorted definitions. And I was wow, I guess I made it in this world. I did it. That's cool. But so I think focusing on being curious, focusing on operationalizing what are we talking about here, and trying to similar with in a interaction, we might be operationalizing, well, what's the goal here? And because if we have clarity about the goal, then it's easier to have a good conversation, a good dialogue around trying to find a resolution and a plan. And if you don't have the same goals, it's going to be really hard to have a good outcome there, because if you're coming in and saying, the number one objective here is revenue, and somebody else is saying, okay, well, my number one objective is quality of life. We need to find some synthesis here. We need to find some place that's going to work for everyone, or it's going to be just a battle.
What a good example of the different ways that asking questions with depth and curiosity to them can be applied in different contexts. Because when it comes to teams accidentally fighting against each other because they're working on different goals, or communicating in ways that are ineffective because they're not getting on the same page about each other's perspectives. Like, there are so many ways where slowing down and dropping into curiosity, taking different perspectives, looking around, observing, asking more, and being willing to be surprised or be wrong can become critical to learning and discovery. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. So what do you think I'm missing, Scott? Like, when you're thinking about, you're like,
When I think about you in your life?
Sorry, Adam.
All right. All right. This was the point of the podcast. I figured it out. You're like, all right, Scott. All right. We got 30 minutes. What am I doing wrong? Tell me what I got to do.
I'm sorry. I just can't. What am I missing when you are thinking about, I'm still stuck on this word wonder. While you were talking a moment ago, you said you're wonderful, like you're full of wonder, and wonder was the word, when we are keeping life interesting by holding with grace all that we don't know, have never learned, never encountered, never experienced, and then bring that curiosity and sense of wonder into everything we're doing. And to me, that feels really critical. Like, that can be our jumping off point for how we live. If we approach people, relationships, teams, and work product, whatever that end product is. You and I come from the healthcare end, so we're tending to think a lot about various aspects of that. But certainly, creating a product and generating revenue are also important parts of that. But, if those are kind of what we're proposing is a process of living or a process of approaching life, I'm curious if you think that an element of curiosity is missing from that summary, missing from this conversation so far.
Yeah, I think we could always use more curiosity, definitely. Well, I think curiosity. Oh God, I was about to have like a really annoying comment to be like, "What is curiosity?" And it gets like getting meta about meta is like too much in a sense. But I think curiosity. But you can be curious like in an objective kind of perspective. But we're curious about like how is this other person seeing it, and then I think also a lot of times we come back to the context, right? The context of how does it make perfect sense that we're in the situation that we're in? And then from there, I can understand, well, what are the processes that are contributing to this, right? Because whatever we're doing, it was a solution in a sense. Maybe not a good solution, but it was a solution. How does it make sense that this was a solution? What was the problem this was solving? And whatever my new solution is, I need to account for the previous problem that was being addressed. And that's pretty important. I need to have some curiosity about, does it have to be this way? Are there other ways it could be? Can I share another quick Socrates story?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. So I think I have so many favorite Socrates stories, but this is my true favorite Socrates story. So just because this was before the age of like YouTube and like TikTok and stuff, so when they were bored, they had to entertain themselves. And so there's this story about Socrates is kind of bored one day, and so him and the boys join a beauty contest, which is really funny because Socrates, although you see these statues of Socrates and he's like buff and chiseled, that's not the way Socrates looked, at least according to the records we had, right? According to the records we had, Socrates was like short and fat and bald. His eyes were bulging out. They called them crab eyes because they bulged so much. And his nose was upturned, and he had a lot of everybody's a good body and everybody's beautiful, but the Greeks had this idea of an Adonis, and he was not an Adonis. He was definitely not an Adonis. And so he enters this beauty contest, which is just kind of funny, right? It'd be like if Danny DeVito was like the sexiest man alive. Like I would be like, yes, Danny, he gets it. I love him. His soul is beautiful. This is good. But like, it would be surprising. So basically, Danny DeVito is in this like beauty contest, but he's still being Socrates. And so they're getting ready to judge him, and he's like, "Well, like, what does it mean to be beautiful? How are we defining this? What's going on?" And they're like, "Oh my God, he's doing it again," and so So he starts talking about like, well, what does it mean to be beautiful? And they're like, well, we all know what beauty is. Like Socrates, like just do it. He's like, no, hang on, let's talk about this. And so he starts kind of testing the limits, and he says, well, are only humans beautiful? And they're like, well, no, like a horse could be beautiful. It's like, okay, so like a horse could be beautiful, and they're like, yeah, even like a spear, if it's well made for your function, that could be really beautiful. And he's like, aha, I can use this. And then he says, okay, so functional is beautiful. They're like, yeah, functional is beautiful. He's like, well, great. Let me tell you something. And then he goes through all of these things that had been liabilities. Like, my eyes are bulging out, and you make fun of me for these crab eyes. Well, guess what? I can see, I have better peripheral vision. I can see to my right and I can see to my left better than you because my eyes stick out further. Right? I have this pig nose that you make fun of. Guess what? I can smell better than anyone else. Also, my nose doesn't block my eyes because it's turned up. I can see better. So he goes through these lists of things, and it's just this like silly, whimsical kind of interaction. But I think it highlights kind of this curiosity and this like playful wonder of like, what are we talking about? Does it have to be this way? Are there other ways of looking at things? And not like in this like exhaustingly like existential kind of way, but just like playfully everyday things. Like, well, why are we doing things the way that we do them? Does it have to be that way? So a little bit like when a toddler says why, but like not as annoying.
And, I actually really, really appreciate that because that is a stance shift that I think all leaders could adopt. And I appreciate how playful it is. Like, well, does it have to be this way? Could we think outside of the box in this and it not be threatening? It not have to be interpreted as we're doing something wrong. We don't know what we're doing. We don't know what we're talking about. But that a part of our practices in our workplaces could be not just like antagonistic devil's advocate, but just true open-mindedness. Can we just look at other perspectives on this? Be Socrates in a beauty contest and just get really curious. That's our takeaway is gonna be like be Socrates in a beauty contest.
Socrates in a beauty contest. I like it. Well, I think that, just to dovetail on what you're saying, I think the goal is to ask why, but not to be an anarchist, right? The goal isn't to say there's no rules, nothing matters, let's throw it all away. But like, if you're in a system, you're saying, well, why does it have to be this way? We're trying to understand what's the scenarios, the context, the variables that led to this solution, so I know why it's in place. Then I can understand if we want to make adjustments or not, what kind of adjustments need to be made.
Yes. And, beauty standards is such an interesting one when we think through, like this is not one that, there was pressure to universally adopt some of these things, but there is nothing that says we have to. So in this case, it's not chaos to say I'm rejecting that beauty standard. If anything, we may say this is a really logical, helpful conclusion to reject that beauty standard and to embrace something else. And that's just a small way, but we can do that with any process that we hit a limit of in our work or in our personal lives. Boundaries and ways that we try to communicate with others that we then find this isn't really working. Why am I telling myself, or why am I holding tightly the idea that I have to do it this way? Because I don't. That's a construction, and I can hold that just as lightly as I hold anything else. So I think there's something really beautiful to allowing questioning to guide us in those directions. Again, like you said, not for antagonism and, just the sport of it, but so that it makes space for us to transform and be open.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and I think I know I have so many words, but I think also, there's like an interpersonal piece, but intrapersonally, like I can use this on myself, right? If I'm in a meeting and I'm really mad at like what somebody's saying, or I'm really annoyed or really bored or something, I can ask myself like, why am I having this reaction, right? Why is this idea so threatening to me? Is it actually threatening? Do I have some kind of reaction to it that's beyond what's actually happening in the interaction? And maybe I need to work on smoothing out some of my edges that are going on here.
Yeah. I love that as a practical takeaway, because turning that curious lens to ourselves and saying, why am I not to invalidate it or negate it, but to actually just bring that open curiosity to it. I keep saying the word curiosity, but to bring that openness to it of, let me explore a little bit what's going on with me here. Not in a right or wrong, not in a judgment or categorization way, but in a, let me find out more. Maybe there's something I can learn about myself, or about a trigger, or about some conclusion I've drawn or pressure I feel that I can only access if I hold this in an open, willing kind of way. And so if we ask ourselves the question in that prompting moment where the thing has now shown up, the reaction is happening, then rather than engaging in a behavioral reaction, calling our boss a name, or, wearing our anger or frustration or upset on our sleeves, disappointment on our sleeves. Instead, we can kind of hold, and maybe building the capacity to hold is an important part of this process. Can I slow down enough to just hold what's here, breathe into that space, be with it, so that I can learn and discover more? What do you think?
Yeah, I love it.
Awesome. So, any final words before we start to bring our time together to a close? I always love my time with you, Scott.
I know. I reject the idea that this call is going to end. I reject the idea that this podcast is going to end. That's silly. Why do we have to stop, right? Yeah. So can I share my favorite Stoicism quote? Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Okay. So my favorite Stoicism quote is actually by Epictetus. So Epictetus is a unique philosopher in ancient Rome. So a lot of times when I'm teaching people about Stoicism, we're talking about the wisdom of essentially kind of serenity prayer, like control what you can't, accept what you can't, trying to find the wisdom of the difference, and then focus on trying to live a good life. Because a lot of times people say, well, that's easy if you're Marcus Aurelius, right? If you're the emperor, you can control everything, so it's easy to say, well, just control what you can. Of course, anyone who's been in a leadership position knows actually that just because you're in charge doesn't mean you're in control. And actually, there's a lot of control you don't have when you're in a leadership position, because you can control what the rules are, but you can't control whether people follow them, or you can't control hearts and minds or contexts or variables. And Marcus writes a lot about this in Meditations, about all of these just like meddling, annoying people that he's dealing with. And he's like, I'm going to remind myself that they're there, and I'm not going to let it ruin my day, is a nice thing that he says. But Epictetus is kind of on the other side, right? So Epictetus was born in what's modern-day Turkey. He was enslaved for about 30 years. After he was freed from slavery, he wandered into a Stoicism lecture hall where Gaius Musonius Rufus was lecturing, who was like the Roman Socrates, like just like famous, like wildly ethical, just like the guy. He wandered into his hall, and Rufus was like, "This is my guy. I like him. This is interesting." And he took him on. He like personally like taught him Stoicism, and then Epictetus became like the most influential philosopher of his time. And there's like a real there's a heart and a depth to his philosophy. But one of my favorite quotes that he wrote is, each situation offers two handles, one that can uplift and one that can't. When your brother wrongs you, don't clutch the handle of his wrongdoings, as it can't lift. Instead, grasp the handle that reminds you he is your brother and you share a bond. This is the handle that lifts. And for me, I think there's a lot of beauty in this, right? And he's essentially trying to say, like, be pragmatic in your interactions with people, but also the heart matters. Like if I have a problem with somebody, I'm not gonna, if I confront them based on here's what you did and this is wrong and you suck and this is terrible and I like beat them down, that's generally like I might feel better because I just dropped my emotions on you, but usually things don't get better, right? Punishment suppresses behavior, is what we as behaviorists know. But if instead if I can try and find our connection and try and lift somebody up, that has the potential to change things. Of course, psychotherapeutically, you and I might turn this internally. We might say you can't beat yourself down and lift yourself up at the same time, right? If you're mad at yourself for something you're doing, being mad at yourself and being mean to yourself is not going to make it better. That's not the handle that lifts. But if you can hold on to this compassion for yourself, you might be able to lift yourself up.
Yeah. Oh, Scott, I appreciate you so much.
Oh, thank you. Ditto.
Yeah. I'm really grateful that you came here today to help share with us. And so now I'm going to turn to thanking our dear listeners. So thank you for being a part of this movement of helping others in the workplace to enhance their individual and collective team performance. And thank you, listeners, for downloading the podcast. And we hope that you'll subscribe. Please contact us through our website, workwisdomllc.com, no spaces, where you can enjoy Work Wisdom Press and productions and ask questions and give us suggestions for topics and all of those kinds of things for future episodes. Stay tuned for more in our series on curiosity. And again, thank you, Scott, so much for taking the time to be with us and sharing your insights today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Yay.